Our foster care system is shattered. And this podcast is about how we as a community can come together to bring about change in the system and changing the lives of children in foster care. Hi, my name is Rob Shear. I'm the founder of a national charity called Comfort Cases. I'm an advocate for children in foster care. I'm a public speaker. I'm an author of A Forever Family. But most important, I'm a dad to 5 of the most amazing kids. Welcome to the Fostering Change podcast. Well, here we are again, another episode of Fostering Change. You know, I've said this probably every week that the guests that we have had on our show have truly educated me in ways that I never thought. You know, I was talking to one of my sons last night, and I was telling him about how, dad's 55 almost, and I always thought where you can't teach old dog new tricks, but I have learned through this podcast experience that everybody can learn something at any given time. And that's exactly what my friend Garon has done. Garon has written a new book called You Will Always Be White to Me. I will have to tell you, I have not read a book this thick in a very long time, including my own memoir. But I was excited to be a part of reading this book. I'm excited that this book is getting ready to be available for everyone to read it. And by the way, Garon, before we get started, I will have to tell you, this book truly, as an adopted dad, as someone who raised children of color, I think that this book does more than just for adopted dads, but really shows how someone goes through life with so many different changes. So the first thing I want to know, my friend, is why?
Thank you for having me, man. I really appreciate it. It's so nice to see you. Why did I write this book? It's been an idea for so long, over a decade. In my 20s, people, especially after I came to the United States, people said, you've got to write your story. This is not something we hear about often. And I think many people would understand that, like, to write a memoir in your 20s, it feels so young. My thing was, who wants to read a memoir by someone in their 20s? And for me personally, I had a lot more that I wanted to do in my life. It felt very like I was in transition. And then cut to many years later, and around the time that Colin Kaepernick became the name and the face of every news cycle. And there was this very robust conversation happening in the country during which people took very different sides about whether he should be kneeling or whether he should not. One thing that I found incredibly interesting about that was that in almost no TV or online new media article did it mention that he has white parents, that he was adopted. And I went and I started asking my friends, do you know that Colin Kaepernick was adopted? And people on both sides had no idea. And I thought that was a really fascinating thing to omit, because I think, and I'm sure I would imagine your kids might say the same, and I know you have teenagers now, so I'm sure those conversations are beginning raw, is that when you are a brown or black kid being raised by white parents, you exist in the world in one very specific way as a child. And then you sort of get used to the privilege that comes with that. And then you become an adult and you move into the world by yourself. And to a certain degree, you're walking around still imagining that privilege exists. And it doesn't. And it shouldn't, really. But you're treated differently. And I thought that if someone had talked more to Colin Kaepernick at that time about that, that's the interview I would have wanted to watch, about what that looks like and why he arrived at his decision based upon all that. So
I know your husband, Jamie, and who, by the way, is white. And you are a person of color, whether that, you want to call yourself brown, whether you want to call you're a person of color. You are raising 2 children One who is, I would consider black, just like one of my children, and
Okay.
one I would consider brown, just like one of my children. How do you, knowing what you know now after writing this memoir, because you made a comment, and I talk about this quite often. When I walk into Macy's or to Nordstrom's, um, no one looks at me differently. What they want to know is, oh, I wonder if he has a Nordstrom's credit card, and I wonder what his credit limit is. You know,
Yeah.
and then when I see my son Makai, who is 6'1", wears a hoodie, and I see him walk in, and I look at people stare at him, and I see where my white privilege has come in for myself. How are you now knowing all of this, raising your boys?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I mean, I feel I've had enough life experience and experiences both in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, um, and the United States to understand how race is, how you might be treated in specific situations, both negatively and positively. To your question, I'm more concerned about my white husband seeing the discrimination of his children for the first time. Our kids are much younger than your kids. Our kids are 3 and 8, and right now they're cute. Uh, but as you know, I have two boys. As black men transition into young adulthood, sorry, preteens, teenagers, then young adulthood, it takes on a very different. Society sees them very differently. So I have had conversations with my husband saying, I really need you, and I really want you to prepare for this. And I want to give you one example. We live in a really friendly neighborhood. Um, Unfortunately, my son's the only black kid as of now. Well, both of them are the only two black children in the neighborhood. But we live in Fort Lauderdale, and anyone that's been to Lauderdale knows that there are mangoes everywhere, dropping all over the road, kind of in people's yards. And my husband, earlier, in once after moving here, I would notice as we were going for a walk, the kids would see mangoes dropped into people's front yards that were clearly not going to be used, and he would be like, "Yeah, you can grab a couple. People are friendly. People know you guys around here." And I just stopped him and I said, Jamie, I have to tell you, like, no force on earth would have me walking into somebody's front yard to take fruit from their yard and then get back on the road and walk down to my house. I just know as a brown guy, that's not an okay choice. And you are teaching our young, brown and black children that this is like a norm, that this is okay. And right now it probably is. But when they are 13 and doing that, somebody might shoot them.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and said, like, I've never considered this. When I grew up, we just walked through people's yards, if fruit had fallen down the trees and taken it. And I said that this is just one very small example of how complex this issue is. And so we're still working through all that. He's a very enlightened guy, extremely well read, he's very well traveled. But he grew up in a predominantly white area. And I think sometimes your childhood just doesn't teach you as a white person what you need to understand if you're raising black children. And that's why we should all of us, regardless of color, sexual orientation, gender, whatever, learn from the experiences of others.
I agree. I agree with you 100%. And I learned so much in your book about experiences. And by the way, you have done a hell of a lot at your young age. But I was like, I have to agree with you. I remember when one of my children, probably about the age of 9, wanted to be a police officer for Halloween. And at first we were okay with it. But then when we went to the costume store, and as he was gathering the costume, there was a gun, and he really wanted the gun, and it was a toy gun. It was a typical police officer. But we stood in this costume store, and I was adamant why he could not have this costume. And my husband, much like your husband, grew up in a very dominant white neighborhood, could not understand why we were not allowing our 10-year-old to be a police officer who we should respect and looked up to. But I also had to reassure him that a boy of color carrying a gun, even as dressed up as a police officer, could have a target on their back. You know, and that to me is something that as society,
we have to change. Now, you grew up in so many different places. I mean, you were raised in South Africa and Hawaii. You were in Gambia. You were in Jamaica, Louisiana. Louisiana story you and I are gonna talk about. But you were also raised. I know your siblings. I know them because you and I have been friends for years. It- was it easier because you had siblings? I mean, you and your sister look identical.
Yeah, it was. I mean, and that's kind of amazing because I was adopted from Sri Lanka and she was adopted from the Philippines, but it was much easier to go through the experience of being an adopted kid living with white parents in Africa, in the Middle East, all over, having another sibling who was adopted. It's actually something I never really thought about until I was an adult. Um, how normalized that made it in our family. Knowing that and hearing her stories, her story of how she arrived in my parents' arms, how they found her. It made, as the second child, my story just seemed like, yeah, isn't this how this happens? And then of course, when we moved to South Africa and they thought they could not have a child naturally, they had my little brother who's blonde hair and brown eyes. So at that time it was like, oh, it happens this way too. And it was, yeah, a total like shakeup of our family, but in the best way. I do think it would have been, and I always say, I think it would have been extremely difficult to be adopted from Sri Lanka and then flown directly to New Orleans. And then to have grown up on Bernice Drive, many readers will come to know Bernice Drive in Louisiana, in this very small, exclusively white town. As the only brown kid, that would have been hard. But we were, the two of us, brown kids growing up in Africa or the Middle East or wherever. My parents were actually minority. And, add to that, we had this life that is, I'm always sort of shy to even talk about it here in America, but, when you grow up overseas, usually people oftentimes who are living that life, that diplomatic international sort of life, have housekeepers and drivers and gardeners and all of our, these wonderful people that lived in our home. I mean, they were also the same color as us. So really, if anyone was a minority in our house, it was my parents. And that was very different for us.
So what got your parents to be overseas? Now, I know your mom's a sex ed teacher. So, I mean, what actually, I mean, that moment that you're living overseas and you have the housekeepers and you have the drivers, and I have friends who live overseas, they have the same situation. It's very typical, depending on what level in the overseas. And all of a sudden you come to Louisiana. I'm assuming you did not have all the staff in Louisiana that you had when you were living, in South Africa.
Correct. And so Louisiana, at the very beginning of my life, it was this place we heard about, Louisiana. All right, my parents are from there, but I'm not really from there. But every summer we travel back. Louisiana is where I became an American citizen. It was my introduction to the United States. So initially traveling back each year, there was, it felt like a different country. And I always say, like, it really was a different country to me, though, because I was living in South Africa. And yes, that was just summer visits. Now in 1998, we lived there for 1 year. And we didn't have any of the kind of staff in our home. And I don't think we thought much of it because no one else did there either. I understood in America, that's not how people live. And certainly we were living 5 houses down from my grandparents, and that's not how they were living. So it was different, but it was different in the way that every country was different, right? Each time we landed at a new airport, it was like, here's a window into an entirely different life.
I need to know. So you're back and forth. Let's say, and you see where our country sits today. You have raised your boys or raising your boys. One of your boys you raised in the District of Columbia before you and your husband moved to Florida. So there was a huge difference there. And now all of a sudden, how do you feel that we're going as a country?
Oh, wow, Rob. I mean, the first time I heard this quote, I believe it was Hillary Clinton quoting Winston Churchill. She said, the United States always gets around to doing the right thing after they've tried everything else. And I sort of feel that's how the US is. It's like progress is there. It certainly is, but it's so slow moving in a way. For a country that has the potential, the capacity to move fast, it's so slow moving on environmental science, on race issues, on gender equality, sexuality. Why does it take us so long when Europe, has been able to like transform and transform and transform? The last 4 years were hard. I think anyone reading my memoir, obviously within the first couple of pages will get that. No, I'm not a Trump fan. And it was hard to watch the country kind of like open up this, or what I felt was a vocalizing of racism again. That Trump made it okay for many people to do, to sort of verbalize how they felt. To a certain extent, at least you're aware of like the populace, that there is this segment of the population that does feel this way. I just wish that things would get better faster. Someone like you having this podcast, I mean, listen, you're an extraordinary person, and the amount of the platform that you have and the outreach that you do, I mean, it enables these conversations to take place. But the problem is, I wonder how many people that feel the way I just described would ever be watching this interview. And to some degree, that is reinforced by a 24-hour news cycle, where if you're a Fox News watcher, you can watch Fox News all day long in your house and have your racist beliefs reinforced. If you're MSNBC, super left, you can watch MSNBC all day long and have your super left ideas reinforced. It's a struggle, and I think it's going to take a long time to get to a place where we are sort of in a more moderate and a zone where more people are in the middle.
No, I agree. And it's probably one of the reasons why we're going to start doing Fostering Change more than once a week, because I truly believe that talking about things is how we educate each other. I got so many more questions about, your book, You'll Always Be White to me. First of all, love the cover. Think you did a great job on the cover. But I have a question as soon as we get back. Listen, everyone, we got to take a quick break. We want to thank our sponsors, but I also want to thank everybody that has shared our podcast. Those of you who have been sending me emails to fosteringchange@comfortcases.org, asking your questions, thinking about guests that you would like to be on. When I started this podcast over almost 2 years ago, I started it because I wanted to talk about foster care and adoption. But I've learned what I want to talk about is change, and how each and every one of us have that opportunity. So I'm asking each and every one of you to do me a big favor, whether you're listening to this on, Apple or Google or Spotify, share the podcast, because you never know who you're going to impact. And then if you're following us on our YouTube channel and you have subscribed, please leave a comment. We want to know how you're doing, good and bad. So we'll be right back.
This episode of Fostering Change is sponsored by Comfort Cases, a national nonprofit that is inspiring our communities to bring dignity and hope to youth in foster care. For just $10 a month, you can support the Comfort Cases mission to eliminate trash bags from the foster care system. For every $10 donated, a Comfort XL duffel bag will be given to a child entering foster care. Please help us be part of the change. Go to comfortcases.org and see how you can help a child entering our foster care system.
So, we are so excited to be part 2 of this amazing interview with my friend Garon, who has written You Will Always Be White to Me. I remember when you reached out to me about this book, and I was really excited about it as well. And so I, because I travel so much, I read most of my books on my Kindle, because I'm in and out of airports. But I actually wanted to touch this book. I wanted to feel this book. I absolutely love this book. And I'm so impressed with how raw you are in the book. I hear that when people read my book, A Forever Family, but I read a lot of memoirs. And you can see next to my desk, I read a lot of memoirs. And most time people sugarcoat things, and they really are not all into telling everything, but you did. And I want to talk about your mom. You had a special relationship with your mother.
Yes.
And knowing that your mother has passed, I still, whenever on social media, and by the way, guys, if you're not following my friend on social media, you've got to follow him. You've got to find him, because some of the little tidbits that I get out of you on social media, you have no idea how it's made me relook at something. And so, with your mom being a sex ed teacher in South Africa, it was during a time when that was just something that wasn't talked about.
Except for in my house. Yes. It's funny. It's like I think this is true of all the kids. You grow up and whatever your parents' profession is, you just think like, doesn't everyone's parents do that? There's a great show on Netflix called Sex Education where the kid's mom is a sex therapist. And when I watched it, I just related so much because I was like, yeah, this is kind of how it was to some degree. Nikki Wade. That's my mom's name. And yes, she unfortunately she died in 2001.
Wow.
But when we were living in South Africa, she was a sex ed teacher, teaching young South Africans about biology and also, safe sex practices at the time when HIV and AIDS was kind of coming to prominence and being spoken about. I write in the book that I knew the word sex before I ever knew the word God or religion. We were not a religious household, and I don't even remember the first time we talked about sex because it was just always was. They made it very clear early on what sex was, that they had sex, that one day we would have sex. And it was very, I think, liberating. I talked to a lot of people, straight and gay, as adults who have a lot of shame around sex. I never have. And I think it's because of having your mom's a sex ed teacher. It's just like talked about at the dinner table, I learned as I got older that was certainly not everyone else's experience.
That's not everybody else's experience, and that is not the dinner conversation that the majority of people have. But do you feel that you're raising your boys differently than your neighbors because of the experience of what your mother being a sex ed teacher?
Oh, absolutely. Our son is 8, and our oldest son is 8, Mateo, and he already knows about sex. When he started asking me, about reproduction and yes, I just sat him down and said, listen, this is how it is, and kind of walked him through it. I feel I am very similar to my mom, and I also want them to have correct information. I think there's this thing, like you don't have the information, and then, that's how, like, teen pregnancies happen often, and people don't really know what they're doing, and you can't make informed decisions without knowing what's going on. So definitely, and we have conversations even now with our neighbors, oftentimes straight couples who are like very hesitant to talk about sex. I think this is also a very American thing. Having grown up around the world, I'm going to go to Europe. Like I find Western Europe to be far more progressive on this issue. I think we all know that. And I also wrote about in the memoir about how, like, as a 12-year-old, my mom walked us through the red light district in Amsterdam. And was like, these women that you see in the windows are working. They are prostitutes, and it's here in Holland it is legal, and that's a wonderful thing because they now have access to STD checks, and they are protected. They're not doing it in like back alleys where they can be harmed. This is a work, and this is a job, and I still today say, like, sex work is work. Don't shame these people. Also, for me personally, and I think, listen, it's everybody. If you're watching porn, don't shame people who act in porn. I don't get it. Why would you be a consumer of something and then shame the people that you're watching? It just never made sense to me.
I don't think it makes sense to a lot of people, my friend. So, but there are those few who want to say that it shouldn't happen, but there are also those ones that I would love to see their browser on their phone. There was a lot of serious issues that you actually wrote in You'll Always Be White to Me. Gun violence, racial discrimination. You actually even wrote about Al Qaeda. You wrote about domestic abuse. I really want to know, out of all of those topics, what was one of the hardest things that you wrote about?
Gun violence. I was held up for the first time by a military officer with a machine gun when I was 7, 8. It even like kind of, it's weird to even speak about sometimes. And I don't think most kids have that interaction. It was terrifying. As a young kid, I was by myself. I still vividly can remember the barrel of the gun moving across my face. And it was during a military takeover in the Gambia. And then throughout the years, you know, one of my friends, our family friends, was killed by Al Qaeda operatives, and with a gun. And there's just been so many instances. And then I come to the United States in 2004, and we have, you know, there's many school shootings since Columbine. We have Pulse. You know, I moved down to Lauderdale, and we have the Parkland massacre at the high school. And then I'm an air traffic controller. And I was first at Washington Tower, where when I was at Washington Tower, I was so prepped for gun violence, and I was trained by the security services in DCA how to respond in that situation. When we moved down to sunny, beachy Lauderdale, I was like, oh man, this is gonna be great and fun, and life's kind of like slow and easy. And you know, within, I believe it was the first year of me working as a controller at Fort Lauderdale Tower, we have a shooting in the airport, where I walk up the stairs into the tower off my break, coming in to start controlling, and all I'm hearing on the phone is the supervisor saying, "Okay, multiple casualties, Delta Terminal. You guys probably all know of the young man that came from Anchorage, and I believe it's Anchorage, yes, and landed in Lauderdale, and you know, came through baggage claim, loaded up his gun, and killed a bunch of people." Killed people and harmed people and really terrorized an entire community. This stuff continues and nothing's done about it. You know, writing about that, when you say what was the hardest, writing about that and to see over 30 years that not much has changed, that's difficult.
Yeah.
And I don't know when this country is going to like wake up and get it. I don't know what it takes.
I mean, I have to agree with you. And you know, the fact is, I'm going to be 55 this year. And when I was a kid in elementary school, middle school, high school, I never heard of a gun shooting in school. It just didn't happen. And I don't know where we turn the tides, but there's something, Garon, there is something that we have to do, and we have to do it sooner than later. And you know, it's like you know it, being a dad of two kids of color. It's like, where do they? I mean, right now I see pictures of your kids, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're so adorable. And I see pictures of my children, and I think they're adorable. But then I think, when did society start getting scared of them? You know, when did they start? When did society stop walking? When they started walking across the street to cross the street because of the color of their skin? And, you know, that leads me to one of my last questions I have for you, my friend. I want to know how you came up. Well, first of all, I have two questions. Number one, if the pandemic had not have happened, would you have written the book as soon as you had?
Absolutely, categorically no.
No.
Yeah, no, because I'd just been in South Africa. We were adopting our youngest son. Flew back on March 13th, landed in the United States, and realized, you know, it was that weekend when the United States was like, okay, everyone quarantine. This is for real. We've had this information since January, but we're only doing something about it now. Trump administration, and let's buckle down. And because we had been at the bottom of Africa, it wasn't really so much a reality for us there. Now, of course, that has all changed. So when we landed back, I had a year and 4 months off from the tower because I'm a controller that has asthma. They said, if you're a controller that has asthma, stay home. I'm super fortunate. I don't want anyone watching this to think like somehow I juggled 2 kids and a marriage and an air traffic control career, and I just happen to write books at night. I mean, let's be realistic. I have a nanny. I have a husband that's super supportive. I had a year off from work, and it allowed me to write this book. And my husband, James Siriano, some of you probably know him, he actually came to me and said, Garon, if you don't write your memoir now, you will never write this memoir. Don't you hate it when your husband's right?
He's
So
read way too many times, my friend. You know, and by the way, I love your husband's books. Your husband has signed some books for me. They're sitting on my nightstand. But then now my question is, you'll always be white to me. Is that society? Is that you? Or is that your family?
excellent question. I'm not giving it away. I haven't in any interview I've done so far because I want people, here's why. I want people to move through the memoir and be asking themselves that question. Is it him? Is it a parent? Is it a lover? Is it a teacher? Is it my commentary on society? Is society's commentary on me? It's interesting, right before this book came out, there was some interview I did on the West Coast in Oregon. And as that came out, there was this, someone sent me this link online to this comment that someone I didn't know had made. The person was not a brown or black person and said, how ridiculous. Imagine if I had written a book that was titled, You'll Always Be Black to Me. Everyone would hate me and no one would read it. And I thought, and then it listed all these comments, people jumping on their side, people saying like, you shouldn't say, and it was very interesting for me to read. First of all, everyone's entitled to their opinion. I certainly want anyone who feels that, they should be able to voice it. I also think you should read the book because it might surprise you. It might not be what you think it is.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I agree with you. And what a great teaser. What a great teaser. Listen, you know what? It is always a pleasure to talk with you. I'm so proud that I get to call you my friend. You know, I tell people this isn't something where I get to have a guest on my podcast and it's all, I mean, I literally consider you and Jamie and the boys our friends. And I want you to know how much we love you, how proud I am of you. And I want everyone, please, 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 please purchase this book. You know, it's coming out right here at the summertime, and we all know that we're still like trying to figure out what to do during the summer. Lay by the beach, read it. You are going to love it. But then this is what I want you to do. Once you've read it, I want you to email me. Email me at fosteringchange@comfortcases.org, and I want you to tell me from what I experienced why the title is the title. Garon, thank you so much. We will have our links of where you can pick up this amazing book. Please do us a big favor. Make sure you share this podcast. Subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. Make sure you talk about the change because each and every one of us are different and you have no idea how we can impact each other. So until we meet again, everybody continue to be part of the change. A good human. That's all we can ask. Take care, everyone.
I would like to thank all of you for listening to the Fostering Change podcast. You can subscribe on all of your favorite podcast streaming platforms, including Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. Make sure you follow Comfort Cases on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter at Comfort Cases. Check out the Fostering Change blog at comfortcases.org. And I know some of you have a question, and I know some of you would love to be a guest. Please personally reach out to me at fosteringchange@comfortcases.org. That's fosteringchange@comfortcases.org. Then do me a big favor. Please help spread the word. Share this podcast. Share it with your friends and your family. Remember, I say this quite often, we're all part of the same community, and that community, it's not our zip code, but our human race. Let's all make a difference.